Thank you. All right, so we had a lot of ground to cover, and I just threw it all on the wall. I don't know how much of it stuck or how much of it just bounced right off, and I don't know if I decorated the walls or vandalized them. I'm going to shut the doors here. I do want you to have a Bible in front of you. So thank you, Jerome. If you don't have a Bible, we've got plenty over there. We got quite a few scriptures we're going to try to keep up with today. And but let me start by asking if you have any questions about the story or about the video that you wanted to raise initially to make sure we address it before we're done here. Okay, so I want to address one issue, and this is an issue that arises whenever we go from, I don't mean any of these terms pejoratively, but whenever we go from a naive to a critical reading of Scripture, it confronts us with a real question. Okay, so what do I mean by naive reading? Well, a naive reading would just imagine that everything's literally true. And if there's something in there that just doesn't make sense, it's because God is great and we're not. And so you put up with the nonsensical parts of it. And you just say it's beyond understanding. And there's something very faithful and pious about that approach. I think at some point, even the most critical scholars, insofar as they are believers, do something like that. They will say, I just can't make sense of this. Nonetheless, I still believe it. That's part of faith. And that's why faith and understanding have always had an interesting correlation to each other. They haven't always been the same thing. And sometimes they feel like opposites, but there's usually more of a Venn kind of overlap there, that faith and understanding, we can't quite understand everything. We can't quite believe everything. But there, Anselm's famous dictum was that faith seeks understanding. So in his mind, you start with faith, and then your life of discipleship is you're seeking understanding. Plenty of other people, particularly since the Enlightenment period, like Immanuel Kant, wrote a book called Religion Within the Bounds of Pure Reason. He started with understanding. And, or if you've ever seen the Jeffersonian Bible, Thomas Jefferson was a typical Enlightenment figure. He went through the New Testament and took out everything that he thought was miracle. Doesn't accord with human science and reason. And it, took it out. So faith and understanding have always had a tensive relationship in some way. So when you go from a naive reading of Scripture, which is, it's all true, every bit of it, every word, somehow or another, and then I have to make my thinking fit the truth, to a critical reading, which is something more like, we weren't made to think in order to bracket our thinking and just believe. We are thinking creatures. This is a gift from God. This is part of the image of God within us, and therefore it's what we're given and tools to use. So critical thinking is willing to say, this looks suspicious, right? So, for example, I want to give you an unrelated example to what we've been studying, just to get us started off well. In Genesis chapter 12, there's a story where Abraham and Sarah, they're still named Abram and Sarai at that point, they go to Egypt. And Sarah is so young looking and beautiful that Abram passes her off as his sister. Now, it's either not true or it's sort of true. In some traditions, it doesn't look like she's really a sister. In other traditions, she's his half-sister, because that's how people rolled back then. But he passes Sarah off as his sister because she's so beautiful. And in fact, Pharaoh sees her and says, holy cow, and he gives Abraham a lot of gifts, herds and stuff like that. And then he takes Sarah into his house. But then the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with a plague, to where as long as Sarah was there, they couldn't get it on. All right. So so that happened, and then then Pharaoh sent Sarah back and told Abraham to leave. All right. So that's in chapter 12. In chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah, whose names now have been made Abraham and Sarah, not Abram and Sarah, they're in Gerar. And Sarah is so beautiful that Abraham passes her off as his sister. Guess what happens? The king, Abimelech, sees Sarah, takes her to himself. God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, said, you're about to die because this woman you've taken into your house is someone else's wife. And then Abimelech says to Abraham, what are you doing? Telling me she's your sister. He said, well, she is my sister. Okay. And they send her back. And then Abraham prays for Abimelech, because at the very end of the story, they say, oh, by the way, Abimelech and nobody in his household were able to conceive because God put a curse on them as long as Sarah was in the house. Okay, that story is almost a remarkable retelling of the earlier story. Only the names have changed. In chapter 26, Abraham's son, Isaac, has a wife named Rebecca. Now, let me ask you to guess. Is she ugly or beautiful or in between? She, all right. And they settled in Gerar, the same place where Abraham was. And when the men of the place asked him about his wife, Isaac said, what do you think?
My sister.
All right. For he was afraid to say my wife, or else the men of the place will kill me for the sake of Rebecca, because she is attractive in appearance. This is why we marry ugly, y'all. All right. So after they'd been there a long time, the king, whose name is Abimelech, we've heard this story before, he takes Rebecca into his house. And but before that happens, it happened a little differently. This time Abimelech sees Isaac fondling his spouse, Rebecca, and he calls him into his house and says, why did you say she's my sister? And says, because I thought I might die because of her. And he said, why have you done this to us? One of our people might have easily lain with your wife and you would have been brought guilt on us. Okay, so the details change a little bit, but this is the same story, right? The same story that just kind of keeps being punched around in different ways. And a naive reading of scripture would say, well, Abraham got away with it once. He tried it again. That was just his way, right? Passing her off as his sister because she's so beautiful. And of course, Isaac just learned from the old man, and he does the same thing. And a naive reading would say, no, this could have happened 3 times. I can see that happening. But a critical reading would say, this is the same story. It's just over the years, somebody's telling of the story made it in Egypt with Abraham and Sarah, back before their names were changed. And someone else is had it in Gerar with Abimelech. And somebody else just totally got the story wrong, but started telling it this way, that actually it was Isaac and Rebecca at Gerar with Abimelech. A critical reading would say that, and not as a way of being unfaithful, but as a way of being intellectually honest. So that's where you have the difference between understanding and faith in some way, is that, we're not going to pretend this isn't a repetitive story. we're also, I mean, it could shake your faith a little bit, because what happens is, here's the rub. What happens is, if you say to yourself, these are not three separate incidences that just happen to look exactly alike, except for some small detail, and instead say to yourself, this is a single story that's been morphed and repeated over the years, you have become the arbiter of how the story should be believed. Okay. Now, I mean, there's still a million questions to answer, but you put yourself in that. That's what critical thinking does. it's out of your head, and so it raises the question: who the heck do we think we are? Who are we to put ourselves in the driving seat of deciding, oh, these are real incidences, or versus, no, this is the same story that's just been told or perhaps mistold. So that's a hard thing. And everyone who goes from reading naively to critically struggles with it. And the fear is that when you start reading critically, what you will end up doing is just faith goes out the window. And you start to say, well, it's all simply myth. In the worst sense of the term, it's all simply fairy tales. And I don't believe it any more than I believe anything else. That happens to some people. For most people that I know, and this is my small sphere of connections, for most people that I know, it does not mean faith goes out the window. It means that our faith is expressed through seeking understanding. And I am an incredibly critical reader of everything, but I believe that I do it from the disposition of faith. But when I was in seminary, so I went from a Bible college where my favorite biblical professor there actually encouraged me to go to seminary, encouraged me to go to Union Seminary where he had gone. And my first semester, I'm studying the Hebrew Bible. And I hear the documentary hypothesis that it looks like you've got these four different sources, one of which is the Yahwist, one of which is the Elohist, one of which is the Deuteronomist, one of which is the priestly source, and they're woven together, yada, yada. And I went back to my room and I wrote my professor from college, hand wrote it because I didn't have a computer at the time. And I said, we're learning this thing called the documentary hypothesis. I was acting like he'd never heard of it. And it sounds like it might be true, but what does that say about the Bible and truth and inspiration? And I just don't know what to do with this. And I mailed in that letter. You know how you would do that, and then you have to wait a week or so before they write you back. I mailed him a letter a week or so after I get a letter back that says, dear Mark, no one ever said it would be easy. Hang in there. Doug Beachman. That was it. Like suck it up, go through it. So and so I did, right? I did. And but that day that I wrote that letter, I was thinking, I'm in a place where my view of the Bible and truth and the world and how God speaks has to change. And that is not easy. So the approach that I'm offering to you particularly on this flood story, is one that comes from the perspective of critical reading. I still think there's meaning and truth in this story, even though if you ask me, was there once upon a time a 40-day flood and everybody died except for this guy named Noah and his 3 named sons and their 4 unnamed spouses, I would say no. There are 3 Babylonian stories, much older than this one, about a great flood. My sense is that here's what's going on. there was a horrific flood. I mean, Egypt had flood stories, but they needed floods. They didn't get rain, and this is how they grew their crops and stuff. So flood stories were okay with them, but the Babylonian stories, they also had creation stories and flood stories. Wow. Because my guess, right? I wasn't there. My guess is that once upon a time, there was a horrific and catastrophic flood. And if you are a believer in God or the gods, whether you're Babylonian or Hebrew, and a good God, or gods who don't make it a habit to destroy us all the time, you have to reckon with that. What does it mean to live in a world where catastrophe happens? They also have to reckon with what does it mean to live in a world where wars happen? That's why we have the story of Cain and Abel, a shepherd and a farmer, right? Agriculturalist. They were always struggling over land and resources and stuff. That was the source of wars. That's the first act of violence in the Bible. You have to account for why do we spend time killing one another? What is it about us? What is it about resources that make us do that? Why do we have an earth that has seasons? Why do we have an earth that the ground is fertile? Where did that come from? How is a bunch of dirt fertile? And why is there sometimes barrenness? Why is there sometimes rain? Why there's sometimes drought? Why do women have babies? Why do some women not have babies? Why is childbirth so freaking hard? Why do women die in childbirth? Why do babies survive and some not survive? These are all real existential questions that people have been asking throughout the ages. And if you posit that there is God, loving God, or just God, God or gods, if you posit that there is a supreme power that actually has control over these matters, and was responsible for the origins of them, you got to square the reality and existential threats with which you live every single day and your notion of a loving God. That's called doing theology, and every community did it. And I just encourage you to read these stories as, remember the word we talked about last week, etiological stories, right? Stories of origin, trying to explain why the world is the way it is. Why do we have a beautiful world? But why isn't it perfect? Well, there was a part of it that was perfect once, and then humans screwed it up, and now we can't live in the perfect anymore, but we do live in the abundant world. The rivers flow out of Egypt, out of Eden, into our world. So God's abundance is still here, but it's not paradise. Things happen that aren't great. Why are we violent? We're not sure why, but in this story of Cain and Abel, when Cain is angry, God says to Cain, "Why are you angry?" He says, "Sin is crouching at your door." So sin is depicted almost like a crouching tiger. Sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is to master, but you must master it. And Cain doesn't. He kills his brother. And after he kills Abel and hides him, God says, "What have you done?" Right? And then you get the famous question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "Where's your brother? Am I my brother's keeper?" He said, "What have you done? Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground for vengeance." So you've got that story, which is something of the origins of violence and the repercussions. But you'll notice in that story, God did not kill Cain. In fact, God put a mark on Cain. I don't know what that is. I think it's a tattoo that says, "Be nice to me, I shed blood today," or something like that. He put a mark on Cain so that nobody else would kill him either for revenge. I mean, if you're doing the math, the only other person around is Adam and Eve. But don't do the math. It doesn't work because they married people. Okay, so you see what I mean? And so now you have a story that's about catastrophe. And can anything good come of it? Is there anything about it? Is life worth living if we could have a catastrophic flood tomorrow? Is life worth living if I might die tomorrow, if we might die tomorrow, if we and those whom we love? If we weren't so mobile and we all were here right in Southern California, always on the verge of the next big earthquake, the question would be, do we just live it up until it happens? Because it's coming, right? Or is there a way of squaring the precariousness of life with a loving God? And I think that's the kind of question this story is trying to answer. And just in the big realm of things. Okay, so those are my preliminary remarks. I'm so sorry, I've spent too much time. Did you have any other questions or comments before we get started? I see something. Did I forget to attach the? Dang it. Did anybody write me back and say, hey, Mark, there's no attachment?
No, because it was this morning and I thought it was too late. Although I guess it wouldn't have been, would it?
Well, not for them. Right. Sorry, guys. I'll resend it and actually attach the attachment. That's how I roll. So sorry, I meant to do that, and I will send it. Fortunately for you, we're 25 minutes in. I haven't said a thing about what's on the attachment. So perhaps I should reroute myself and get back to that. Okay, I wanted you to see that both at the beginning and the end of this story, humanity is good and bad. Did you notice that? Mostly bad at the beginning of the story, and they frankly, Noah is the only good thing left. Some other time, maybe we'll talk about the first 5 verses of chapter 6, that weird story of the sons of God coming down and cohabitating with the beautiful daughters of men and creating warriors of renown. That's a weird story. But notice, there was violence. There's violence. That's what God says about the earth. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind, this is verse 5, was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continuously. And verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. I would suggest that for these chapters, the origin of sin, original sin, is chapter 4, not chapter 3. Not Adam and Eve eating the fruit, but it's Cain killing Abel. This is violence. And that's the problem with humans. It's not that they want fruit that they're forbidden to have, but the earth is filled with violence. But likewise, when the whole thing is over, we still get the sense that creation is good and bad. We'll get to that in a minute. In verse 6, this is something that whether you're a naive or a critical reader of scripture, you have to deal with this. Okay? And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. I'm telling you, the Orthodox Calvinists who wrote the Westminster Confession and the Scots Confession and the Heidelberg Confession, they were probably Lutherans, the Helvetic Confession, I don't think they believed this verse, because they had bought into a schematic about God where God is omniscient, all-knowing, never changing, right? God never changing. Even New Testament writers kind of buy into that. But this has God changing. God created, and then God was started. God created. I mean, it's a heartbreaking thing in some respects to imagine. It sounds like a story of the gingerbread man, right? You make the gingerbread man, then he turns out to be a total jerk, right? You kind of wish you hadn't made the stupid thing. just to imagine that God, you can see this as anger, but this verse suggests to me that it's regret and it's the heartbroken God that this is not how I want you to be. I mean, why do you have to do this? Sin was crouching at the door and you can master it and you don't. Right? So that's an interesting thing. God is sorry, which means God can change. And a lot of our theological forebears won't allow that. But these story writers, they don't mind saying this stuff about God. Remember, they can anthropomorphize God a good bit. The middle part of my first slide was that, is the guts of the story. And here's where you have to make, all right, I'm going to give you two places where you have to make a critical judgment on how you look at the story. Okay? Number one, when God is sorry for making creation, you have to decide whether you're going to let this story influence your way of seeing God or not. And if you're going to say God never changes, then you're going to bracket this part of the story and say, well, that's how we experienced it. That's not how God is. I can name 100 pastors who take that approach. Okay? But you have to decide that. The second thing is, and this is, I think, even more important, is this a story of salvation or is it a story of damnation? Or yes, right? So if you focus on the ark and the 8 people in it, and if you assume that flood happens, that's part of life. Flood happens, and in this moment, God saved these 8 people. You can see it as the story of salvation. That's how we teach it to our children. My kids, they had a little blankie that had, an ark with a couple of really happy giraffes, towering over the elephants and the monkeys, right? And we teach everybody to focus on the 8 people and the happy animals. Or is it a story of damnation, where you kind of look away from the boat and think, oh my God, everybody, the other monkeys, they didn't do anything. My sense is that children love this story till they're about 8 or 9, and then they look away from the ark and it shatters them. I think this is one of the first genuine theological crises that children have, is this story, because they start to do the math. And when 8 people survive, how many didn't? When 2 of each kind of animal survive, how many don't? And that's part of their growth. And each of us probably went through that in some way, shape, or form. I don't know if it was traumatic or not. But as critical readers, you got to deal with that. Is this a story of salvation or damnation? Or is it both? And if it's both, what does it say about God? That's unavoidable question for this story. And not a fun one, which is why I don't like preaching from this story. But come this weekend, you'll see what happens. All right. At the end of the whole thing, God is still sorry. Only it's a little bit different this time. God changes again. And this time God says, I'm not going to do that again. I'm never going to flood the earth like this again. That did not go well. God just had a change of heart. This is not how we typically talk about God. But for God to regret having done that and to say, the human heart is still bad, still inclined toward evil. But this is not how to deal with it. God has changed God's mind again. Same thing after the flood as before. And God describes humans in 7:21, after the flood, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Sometimes we preachers like to liken the baptism to the flood, a cleansing, right? Well, it didn't really work. And sometimes I've baptized children, and a couple of years later thought, boy, that didn't work either. It didn't take. That what the flood does not do is eradicate evil. And what you have is a community telling a story that God tried to eradicate evil by eradicating bad people. And it turns out that evil is more fundamental to the human being than the bad apples. And that didn't work. And God's not going to do that anymore. Look at the rainbow made up of water, right? Look at the rainbow, a different way of looking at water. That's God's covenant. God now makes a covenant. This is the first covenant. The things that are different after the flood is God is now in a covenantal relationship with humans. And humans now eat meat. This is the first mention of eating meat is after the flood. Okay, so that was that's what I wanted to do, and just kind of going through the story itself. Now, the second part of my presentation was on the doublets. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this today because I spent too much time on it in the video. I identified 8 different doublets. What do I mean by doublets? Well, think about the story we started out with Abraham and Sarah and in Egypt. And the same story, Abraham and Sarah in Gerar. And the same story, Isaac and Rebekah in Gerar. That's a triplet. That's when a story gets repeated. And we just have to crawl behind the text and ask why. One possibility that Les pointed out to me in an email is that sometimes repeating something was a matter of emphasis, just kind of drilling it in a little more deeply. And sometimes it can point to other things. And that's why after talking about doublets, I wanted you to see the tension in the story. How many animals? How many types of each animal? How many of each type of animal was on the ark? We've all grown up saying 2, right? Right? Yeah, well, for good reason, right? Because in chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, and of every living thing, all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind onto the ark. They shall be male and female, of birds according to their kind, yada, yada, yada. And then in chapter 17, chapter 7, verses 15 and 16, they went into the ark, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there is a breath of life. 2, you were right. We were taught right. Our little coloring pages were right, except for chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. Take with you 7 pair of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean. So you got clean animals, we get 7 pair of those, and 14 of those, and the unclean, 2 of each. I don't know about you, but I wasn't taught that as a child, singing the animals that came in by twosies, right? We didn't have a verse about the clean animals. And where did the phrase clean animals come from? There's not a law. There's not a distinction between clean and unclean animals anywhere yet in the telling of this story. The creation stories don't make that distinction. Nothing in the 4th chapter, nothing in the 5th chapter. Not till the 7th chapter, suddenly we have somebody referring to clean and unclean animals. What that tells me, and I'm just going to cut straight to the chase, you don't have to believe this, but what that tells me is that one of the communities who contributed to the telling of this story, for them, it's a big deal to distinguish between clean and unclean animals. And the clean animals they're clean. One thing that marks them as clean is that they are worthy of sacrificing to God. So when the whole thing's over, Noah sacrifices 2 of clean animals to God, right? Let's where is Then Noah, in chapter 8, verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. So if there were only two of each, and Noah's like killing one of them after it's all over, it's like, dang it, Noah, you missed the whole point, right? They can't procreate now because it's after that they're told to be fruitful and multiply. I don't think the ark got overly full. So one of the groups telling the story, for them, the distinction between clean and unclean and the necessity to have clean animals for offering pleasing sacrifices to God is the core of faith. And that's the group that we call the priestly group. That's an important value for them. That's central to their faith. There are other groups for whom that's not so central. For them, it's just like, look, the whole point here is preserving the species, not the sacrifice. So you've got, I would argue that the fact that you've got 2, 2, 2, 2 over here, and then suddenly 7, 7, 7, 2, 2 over here is because you have two different communities. For these folks, the point of the vote is to preserve the species. And for these folks, the point is to preserve the sacrifice. And these folks told the first creation story because the point of the creation story was the Sabbath. This is the whole point. And these folks told the second creation story, which is the fertility of the ground and the river running out of Eden into the world, the abundance, and so forth. All right, you see what I mean? So I'm suggesting to you that one reason biblical scholars came up with what we call the documentary hypothesis is because you have these doublets and you have these tensions in the story, the other of which were the names for God. By now, when you're reading the story, I hope that when you see God, you see it. And when you see the Lord in small caps, you're thinking, oh, that's like the second creation story, where that was their name for God. In the first creation story, it was just Elohim. In the second creation story, it was typically the Lord God. And the Lord in our Bibles are in small caps because that's that 4-letter name for God that you're not supposed to pronounce. We sometimes say Yahweh, Jehovah. I think it's better to just say Adonai, like a good Jew. You substitute a different word for God. But that's the holy name of God. And for this community, that's how you talk about God. That's the God who's made known through the fertility of the ground and the riches of the rivers, and the God who breathed life into the nostrils. And in a lot of these verses, now this is all going to be woven together very tightly. The person who edited these stories together in its final product did some fine tuning. But you'll find a verse that describes animals as everything that creeps and all the birds of the air and of every kind. That's from the first creation story. That's the language they use there. And then in the middle of all that, you'll see in whose nostrils were the breath of life. That's from the second creation story. That's the language they use to talk about. At times you'll see God referred to as God. That's from the first creation story. And at times you'll see Lord in small caps. I want to suggest that came from the second creation story. And so in Genesis 1 and 2, you have two different creation stories from two different eras, reflecting some slightly different theology by virtue of naming God differently and looking at the world a little differently. And in the creation story, it looks to me like someone has taken two or more versions of this story, because everybody has to deal with the catastrophe that happened. This flood was shattering for people. What to make of this flood? And over the years, these stories grew, and somebody wove them together like tapestry into one story. But now you've got some tools for how to see the different strands in the story. Look for the names of God. Look for the ways that animals are named. And go back to your creation stories and look at how some of them are similar to the first and some to the second. Does that make sense? Okay, we're not real good at this, and we won't be ever in a long time. I'm not good at it, but just look for it. And let your imagination then help you get that over time, many stories have become one. Because all generations, all communities still have to reckon with catastrophe. And there seems to have been at some point a severe flood in the Levant region that every community had to account for. The Babylonians had 3 different flood stories. They're earlier than this story. The third one is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it seemed to be drawing from one of their older stories as well. But there are 3 different flood stories in the Babylonian literature. There are flood stories in the Egyptian literature. There are flood stories in Chinese literature. This is people after people trying to deal with catastrophe. Okay, so I hope that's not too ethereal and it's helpful. I'm going to push forward a little bit then. So what we're talking about is what's often called source criticism. Source criticism, where when you look at something, you're asking the question, where did that come from? So again, we're going behind the text and trying to look at history and when things might have been written. And when I was in seminary, and this is probably true when Beryl and Les were in seminary, is we were taught the documentary hypothesis that there are 4 sources that make up the first 5 or even 6 books of the Old Testament. And they were identified, you've heard me say this several times, JEPD, the Yahwist, because they tend to use that name for God, the Elohist, because that's the name they prefer for God, the priestly writers, because the emphasis seems always to be on temple related stuff. The priestly writers, we think, wrote that first creation story. Or the priestly writers would care that there are 7 clean animals and only 2 unclean, because you got to preserve the sacrifice, right? And then the last one is often called the Deuteronomist, because the book of Deuteronomy, the word Deuteronomy means something like the reiteration of the law, the re-giving of the law. And the 10 commandments that are given in Exodus chapter 20 are also repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And a lot of the laws that are given in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers are repeated in Deuteronomy. Some people feel like the Deuteronomist was the final editor of the first 5 books and took all of these tradition stories and wove them together, sometimes side by side, like the creation stories, sometimes intricately, like the Noah story, sometimes just chronologically, like Abraham and Sarah passing her off as a sister, and Abraham and Sarah passing him off as his sister, and Isaac and Rebekah passing her off as his sister. And that the Deuteronomist perhaps was the final editor or redactor of the whole thing. I don't know. It does seem that today, among Old Testament scholars, there's less confidence that we've identified 4 particular sources, and this is their characteristic. But there's still pretty much a sense that there is a priestly voice, and there is the Yahwist, Elohist voice. There is another tradition. We don't quite know what to call it. I would say most Old Testament professors today, scholars today, would still argue there are at least 2 identifiable sources. And you can see them in the creation stories, and you can see them throughout. And they would have come from different eras, and the stories would have developed differently, and the theologies are a little bit different. But they're given to us as one story. So what do we do with that as faithful people? Well, Hans Frey, I think, is the one who said, rather than literary criticism and source criticism, we ought to be focused on what he called canonical criticism. And that is, we get the Bible the way it is. So let's just focus on the Bible the way it is. If you want to identify different sources, that's fine. But the real question for us, even after all of that homework, is what is the message of God in this scripture today? And frankly, that ends up being the approach that I take. On Mondays in my video, and on Wednesday in our conversation, I'll tease all these things apart and say, but on Sunday, right, when it's time to preach, it's time for us to gather and worship and to reaffirm that which we believe. We're not going to get up and say, we believe that the priestly writers got it right. Who cares? Well, which of those we think, had the best theology? If we believe that God is alive, and if we believe that God still speaks through these stories, and if we believe that the same God who is inspiring these folks to do their theology and to practice their faithfulness is the same God that inspires us to do our theology and practice our faithfulness, then while we can talk about all of the criticism stuff here, what we're really listening for is, what is God saying to us today through this story, however manufactured or faithful or edited it might be. And that would be the approach I end up taking to preach. Otherwise, I wouldn't be preaching. There are like Bart Ehrman, for example, is a New Testament scholar he's an incredible New Testament scholar. But it does seem to me that in his writings, he has deliberately chosen that to go with understanding over faith. And I think I think he looks at the criticism and stays there. And I look at the criticism and then move on to something else. And so I appreciate a lot of Bart Ehrman's insights, but I don't agree with almost all of his conclusions. Because I think he's a little jaded toward faithfulness. And I'm a little jaded toward jadedness. But I mean, if he were here, we'd probably have a great conversation. He started out, very much a Christian believer, and now is a very strong New Testament critic. And I think he represents one of the real options that we all face when we go from a naive reading to a critical reading. The critical reading can lead you to what I think is a deeper, more informed faith. Or the critical reading can lead you toward rejecting the faith and just seeing the problems, just seeing the human touch and nothing else. And that's the concern my church had for me when I went to seminary. They did not want me to be exposed to a lot of that. My college professor would call it new type exegesis. They were scared that when we start reading critically, we lose our faith. I think this story puts it right out there in front of us. How do you read the Bible? Do you let your faith decide how to reckon with what you see? Can you be honest about what you see and now reckon with your faith? Does your intellect and your faith interact in this story, or do they have to go sit in separate corners and each of them deal with it separately? I think this story, almost more than any other, challenges us to face that. Okay, enough of me. Back to you. What are your questions here? So Betty is asking about the inerrancy view of the Bible, wondering if it developed on its own or whether it was a response to the Islamic view of the Quran. And Betty, I have no idea. None at all. I don't know the history of the Islamic view of the Quran enough to answer that. And I'm not sure if I know the history of inerrancy enough to answer it. I think a key turn in inerrancy came with a scholar named Francis Turretin, who was part of the Scottish common sense tradition. And applying that to biblical reading, it was that the plain reading of the scripture is the true reading. And you have to take it as the word of God, as you read it plainly. Can't explain it away, and anything you don't understand is on you. But your common sense tells you read it plainly. Don't do what we're doing. Don't look for different strands of storytelling in the Noah story. Just read the story. It's a story. Humans were bad. God was mad. Earth was flooded. Humans survived. God made a covenant. All the other stuff, is what it is. But that's just the plain story right there. My problem with that, of course, is that if you do that, then the whole Manichaean approach to the Bible is really strengthened. The God in these stories is a mean God, a mad God, in some sense, a bad God. And I don't know how to square that God with Jesus. And a lot of people think God was really angry and Jesus is kind of God's better side, and you got bad cop, good cop. And that's one of the oldest official heresies in the Christian church. But I think it's how a whole lot of people read the Old Testament, because they don't know what to do with this story. It becomes the archetype for how God rolls. And I'm hoping we can have a better way of reading it. So I'm a little wary of going into inerrancy views. I don't understand half of them, and I don't like being labeled. So I don't know how to answer that question exactly. So someone's asking about the online viewer. Les, I will be actually sending the handout, which I thought I did this morning and forgot to attach the attachment. I've already apologized. Yes, ma'am.
This business of clean and unclean animals, that started there, and from that day to this, the Jews observe it. I think that's where vegans come from. Who decided and how what was clean and unclean? Pigs, I can understand. The rest of it.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, where did the notion of clean and unclean animals come from? I mean, it comes codified in the law of Moses, right? So latter part of Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers. That's when it becomes codified. But by the time it's codified as law, you would think that law, you could say, well, God just decided. And God said, well, these animals are clean, these are unclean. And told Moses, and Moses wrote it down into the law. And if that's how you see it, then you just follow it, period. Or you can also wonder if there was already a practice that some animals were good for consumption and some were dangerous. There was clearly a bias against carrion, right? Against the kind of birds that would eat, the dead armadillos on the side of the road, right? And there are some animals that, because of their feeding habits, seem to be odious to human diet. None of you has ever eaten fried crow, right? we just don't do that. And the idea of doing that is kind of gross. So along the way, there were probably, this is my guess, right? Along the way, there were probably some dietary sense that people had that some things were good for eating and some were not. And religiously, that became some things were worthy of sacrificing to the gods and some were not. Along with that is that some animals are valuable to us more than others. If you have domesticated animals and you raise sheep, that's your livelihood, both for wool and for meat and all of that. And so to sacrifice a sheep is a huge cost, much better than capturing a stray dog and sacrificing it. That didn't cost you anything, just, a couple hours of trouble. But the idea of sacrifice has written into it a sense of value. And so when it came to the temple practices and sacrifices and so forth, the idea was there are some animals that we value more than others. And I think that's the beginning of the idea that some are clean, some are not clean, some are worthy of sacrificing, making a pleasing odor to God, some would be an offense to God. And so forth. So I think the law followed the practice, which is often the case. Yes, sir.
It seems to me much easier to believe in a perfect, unchanging God than an iffy one. So if I choose to do that, and there's all this bad stuff around, don't I need a devil? And where does the devil come in someplace? When do we get to the devil? Next year or next month?
Yeah, well, the devil.
Same.
I think you're not going to meet the devil until Job. If you're reading from beginning to end.
Will we get there in my lifetime?
We all get to the book of Job in our lifetime because it's really reckoning with suffering. But the devil in Job is not this kind of serpentine, awful thing that's just out to kill and destroy. It's more like a prosecuting attorney that says, no, they're guilty, and I'll show you why. No, they're guilty, and God's on the other side saying, no, Job's not guilty. Look at Job. Yeah, but what if I do that? Yeah, Job will be all right. It's kind of an interesting approach. The tradition of Satan and the devil and so forth, probably a relatively late tradition in the Old Testament, probably really took on its heft in the intertestamental period. And by the time the New Testament was written, there's a fully fledged theology of the devil. That still shows a little difference. But by the time the New Testament was written, Satan is the author of evil. But the New Testament is insistent that it's not a polarized world where there's God on one side and the devil on the other, and they're fighting out to see who wins. It's God. And among creation is the devil. So that, anyway, yeah, you don't meet the devil for a while because the serpent in Genesis 3 is never identified as the devil in the story. Later it might be. Okay, I have talked this pony to death here. Okay, now you will never read the Noah story the same again. Everybody, I will resend the message I sent this morning, and I will actually attach the attachment. I'm dreadfully sorry that I forgot to do that. You are all welcome to text me or email me immediately when I do that, because I do that often. And I will try to rectify it sooner rather than later. But that's all for today. So thanks for tuning in, you guys. All right.
So
Saturday and Sunday are both going to be great this weekend. So come to church twice.